Hello, techies. Welcome to the Tech Ties Africa podcast, where we'll bring you the latest stories on tech and startups in Africa. Catch us every Thursday at 10 a.m. WAT on techtidesafrica.podbean.com. Let us know what you think by giving us feedback in the comments or on our socials. Now, on with the show. Welcome to the Tech Ties Africa podcast. My name is Kelvin from Nigeria, and with me is Karen.
Hey everyone, this is Karen Maina from Kenya. Really excited to be here as always. Always excited to be a girl in tech and to discover what's happening in the world of tech in Africa.
Always interesting discussions with you. So today we'll be talking about Loop's pivots to embedded finance, Jumia's cost-cutting measures, Oui Capital's ROI on Moniepoint, and a few other topics. So let's start with Loop's broader pivots to embedded finance. So Loop started as a digital bank in 2017, and it seems they are pivoting to embedded finance.
Yeah. So NCBA is like an amalgamation of two banks. And when this happened, they became one of the largest banks in Kenya and I think in East Africa as well. So they have this NCBA Loop, which is a digital money platform. And their main target market is small businesses and young people. And so I think that them going into neobanking and embedded banking is them trying to stay relevant.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing millennials and Gen Zs are more geared towards digital payments as opposed to traditional banking. And we all can see that traditional banking is dying. And in the next couple of years, I think it will be completely irrelevant to a lot of people as Gen X exits the economy slowly. So I was looking at some statistics, Kelvin, and what I've realized is Gen Z make up about 428 million people in Africa. And of that number, only 40% use traditional banks.
Interesting.
Everyone else prefers the digital bank. So I think this is NCBA trying to meet that new market segment and stay relevant.
Yeah, they are definitely trying to tap into that large number that you just mentioned. But I think one thing that will be interesting to see is how traditional banks and digital banks mix. Because regulations, I don't know that traditional banks will go away for a long time. Because you kind of, at the moment, the regulations require those fiscal institutions. So I think they'll still have a role to play for a while, but maybe down the line, then we'll start to see these digital banks take over. Because for like Gen Z, their first experience with financial institutions is digital. It's not like Gen X that's had, the experience where they had one bank or two banks that they go to. My mom very much likes that physical bank. She wants to see a building that she can go to and, interact with people. But this is something that would be interesting for the next couple of years. I think regulation will make it hard for traditional banks to go away, but we'll see.
Yeah, I also think one of the ways that traditional banks might stay relevant is doing such things and integrating their financial services into non-financial platforms. So like the e-commerce, the rides, the payroll systems, buy now, pay later systems, instant loans when you're checking out maybe of the supermarket or the e-commerce store. So I think they might actually survive the test of time by doing what NCBA is doing. And I think another thing to look out for will other banks follow suit, right? Will other banks in Kenya follow what NCBA has started? Will other banks in Africa do the same? And will they be able to keep up with fintech, which is dominating embedded finance at the moment?
Yeah, and we've kind of already had examples of this, especially with buy now pay later. It's a popular trend in Nigeria. I think it's a popular trend in Africa as well. And on a site like Jumia, for example, I use Jumia to buy a couple of products every now and then. And you would see buy now, pay later options when you're checking out. And some of them that I've seen are actually from traditional banks. Some of the options there are from traditional banks. So we are seeing more and more that these traditional banks are looking at the numbers from the digital space and they want the piece of the pie. At the end of the day, they want to make profits, right? So if the money is there, we are making a play points.
And I think it's also interesting to see how regulators will respond to banking services that are moving into third party platforms. But speaking of Jumia, we had something happening and we are seeing them. They've been cutting costs and they did that last year so that they could reduce their losses. It's a very interesting development because I think Jumia is the biggest e-commerce platform that we have in Africa. And what they do is sort of a pathway for other e-commerce systems to follow. So they cut costs by reducing free shipping, by optimizing their warehouses, by shutting down unprofitable units, and they're trying to see if they can sustain growth while cutting back costs. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what they're doing with their aggressive cost cutting and what that means for them and even for e-commerce businesses in Africa as a whole.
Yeah. So Jumia is one company that personally I really want them to succeed. I just like the brand, so I want them to succeed. I think it's like 12 years now that they have been around and they haven't been profitable throughout that time. So it's worrying, but then they are now adopting these cost cutting measures because before now, the goal was mainly expansion. They were trying to dominate e commerce in Africa. But now we are seeing them cut back. And as much as they are cutting back, so one interesting thing with all of the cost cutting measures they put in place is that if there wasn't like currency devaluation that's leading to higher inflation, which is eating into some of their revenue, the losses would have been a lot less. But we live in a society where currency fluctuations are always happen. So, in the real sense, they are growing in terms of the number of orders they are getting, they are growing in terms of their revenue, but because of the currency fluctuations, they are still not seeing that in terms of the dollar equivalent value. So there is only so much you can do, I think, to cut costs because their biggest markets, Nigeria and Egypt, are the countries that are having these like instabilities in the economy and they are trying their best to, settle things down. And I like to believe that they would get to profitability at some point. Maybe it's the personal bias that I do want them to succeed, but yeah, they would get to profitability at some point. Hopefully soon. Hopefully soon.
So there are two things that come to mind with this. The first one, I think I'll ask you because I feel you're more knowledgeable on it, perhaps. So earlier, I think last year, and just after his election, our president was pushing an agenda for East Africa to have a common currency that is not dependent on the dollar. And so we are able to do more trade within ourselves without these fluctuations that are happening and open up trade. Do you think that if, as Africa, we came up with our own currency where we trade amongst ourselves with that currency and it's not fluctuating, do you think that that would enable more growth for companies like Jumia and better profitability?
So because the world is a global village. So we depend heavily on the global village. And if you depend on the global village, then you have to trade with the global village. If you're trading with the global village, then you have to use a currency that is agreed on to be used. I think it was last week that I saw an article on the different types of goods that are imported into Nigeria. And I realized that they have the foreign versions and the Nigerian made versions. And I realized looking at that list that I use a lot of these foreign products personally. it didn't occur to me that, oh, these are foreign products because I've always just seen them. So I realized that we depend a lot on like imports, at least in Nigeria, for things like food, things like electronics, and things like that. So we would always have that need to use a foreign currency.
Yeah.
But I think we should also do something like the European Union, where like all these countries in Europe use the euro. So we should have something like that because it will help to facilitate trade within Africa. And it's long overdue.
Yeah. And maybe also trying to discourage so much of the outside of Africa imports and seeing how to become self reliant as a continent.
Yeah.
I think that would also lead to better economies overall. Yeah, really cool. And there's something else also I wanted to say with the Jumia issue. And I think we wrote an article on it earlier. I think it was on healthcare though, about logistics and last mile delivery challenges in Africa.
Yeah.
Because I think that's still a really big issue and it's a very expensive endeavor for them in terms of making sure that all these goods are coming in. Especially when, I don't know about Nigeria, but for Kenya, when you open Jumia, there's some things that are shipped from
Yeah.
abroad,
Yeah.
right? And it takes a while before to be shipped in. So I'm sure that kind of logistics is very expensive. And then last mile delivery with our roads becomes an even more expensive endeavor. So I think that also plays into that role. But I'm really excited and I'm also a big fan of Jumia and I really hope that they succeed because I get very amazing products from them at a very cost effective rate. Their delivery lately has been very expensive for me, although that's because I moved out of the capital.
Okay.
And so when you're outside the capital, delivery is more expensive. But I do hope to see if they are paving the way for foreign investments or if more local players will come in and join in this move to grow e-commerce. And also if they finally turn profits, I would like to see if this will signal that Africa e-commerce is ready for a second wave of growth. And maybe we'll see a lot more startups get into that space and grow across the continent.
Yeah. Just to touch on briefly, we are seeing some of these global players coming into Africa. Temo is the recent one, and I don't know about you, but their ads are everywhere. So there's definitely something they are saying. There's always that potential, but their challenge is like you mentioned. So I think, especially for a local player like Junior, they have 12 years under their belt now. Yeah, it's a lot of experience and learning that comes from that. So let's see how they perform. Speaking of investments, We Capital got some return on their investment in Moniepoint. They invested $150,000 in Moniepoint, and a couple of years down the line, they partially exited and got a return of $8 million. Not a bad investment at all. One thing that's interesting with the story is how closely they worked with Moniepoint. It seemed that they believed the vision of Moniepoint and they actively worked. So it wasn't, oh, they just put their money here and then just checked out. They actively worked with them, helping them with recruitment, helping them for some pitches. They worked closely with Moniepoint because they really believed the vision. So that's a very interesting dynamic. It's all like the usual story of VCs putting pressure on startups for growth.
Yeah, it was. And it's interesting that it took more than 6 years for them to get here, right? And it's a very exciting thing because it creates a lot of possibility for more VCs coming in and investing in African startups and in African ventures. So we'll have to see if more investors will flood into Africa's fintech after this success of Moniepoint. And if that venture capital, the manner in which they have done it with Moniepoint, if it can be replicated across other spaces. And another thing that I would say is if you look at the startups in Africa right now, a majority of them are in the fintech industry.
Yep.
I think it remains the most investable sector as far as startups go in Africa. But I'd like to see if this will open up space for other industries to grow as well. Before we started this podcast, we were talking about agri-tech. I think health tech is also something else. Would be really interesting to see how it pans out in Africa. And with this success in Moniepoint, they're kind of creating trust for African startups. It's a beacon of African startups can be trusted. And not only can they be trusted, they're capable of growing and creating a really immense return. So hopefully this will open floodgates for more investors, not just external investors, but also African investors. Because for me, this has excited me. I'm like, I should start investing in Africa startups. Yeah, and it's possible for them to actually give me a return.
Yeah, part of the investors were local investors because We Capital is like a fund manager that puts together a fund and then invests in several startups. So part of the pressure to exit was from their local investors because, I mean, there's a return on investments. It's 3 times return. Why not check out now? But they partially exited. They still have some investments in Money Points. Like you said, definitely this attracts a lot of eyes. First of all, that's Africa is, we have always talked about the promise of Africa, and this is a huge move in that direction. And hopefully it does open up other areas like agritech and health tech. But I think those areas require a bit more investment than fintech. I think fintech is the easier one to do because some of the infrastructure for that is already in place. The thing with agri-tech and health tech is that it's capital intensive and you're not really sure about the returns yet. But the thing that happens with development is once one area has to develop, then the ripple effects also affect other sectors. So yeah, it's definitely a positive one for a startup. And for Money Points, the way they did it as well, they pretty much dominated the Nigerian markets. In Nigeria, everywhere you go, you see Money Points, POS, some service from Money Points, from Port Harcourt to Lagos to Uyo. Have moved around a bit in the last year, and I always see Money Points pretty much everywhere. So they dominated like a local market. That's where they found their success from. They didn't have to too much expansion the way we see a lot of startups trying to expand too fast and then fall. Well, yeah, it's a very, very interesting story.
Absolutely. Definitely looking forward to see what comes after this. And in other news, we have seen 8 African countries being among the world's most cyber attacked nations. And we kind of touched on this on the first podcast that we talked about, where we said Africa is quite open to cyber attacks because of number one, we don't really invest in cybersecurity. We don't really have the talent for cybersecurity. The measures, the regulations are still quite weak, and some of them are outdated policies. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of policy making. And we're seeing quite a large list. Nigeria is there, South Africa is there, Kenya is there, Egypt is there, Algeria is there, Ghana is there, Morocco is there, Tunisia is there. So Nigeria had quite a number of attacks in December that took it up the list come January. I don't know if you have any comments to add on to this.
Nigeria is in an interesting spot. I think another thing with Nigeria is that we have a lot of financial institutions in Nigeria. Like there are just too many. And everybody knows like there's money in fintech, right? You're literally dealing with money. So they want a piece of that. Thing that comes with that is a lot of security flaws. And that's what we are currently experiencing a lot of exploits with these financial institutions. But I think with time, it would get better. Kind of like we touched on the first podcast, the more you do something, you make mistakes, you learn from your mistakes, you fix your mistakes, and then you keep moving forward. as a society, we share our learnings. And I touched on having like cybersecurity communities in the first episode. But yeah, we need things like that where people come and share their experiences, especially what went wrong, because we don't talk enough about what went wrong, so that other players are aware of these exploits and they can now fix their own vulnerabilities. So yeah, I believe that with time it will get better, but we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. But I also think there's a positive side to this. And maybe I'm wrong, but this is how I see it. I think there's a lot of digital transformation that is happening in Africa right now. A lot of companies and businesses and governments are figuring out how to digitize everything. And because of that, the surface area on which attackers can take advantage is quite vast.
Yeah.
And because digital transformation is still quite new for us, we're still figuring out how to close down those loopholes, how to bring in the right policies, because the digital transformation is happening really fast. And I think that also creates opportunities for cybersecurity startups in Africa. And I hope that that is something we will start to see going forward. Can we have Palo Alto networks that are African,
Yeah.
where we are creating solutions for ourselves? And I think that would be something interesting that I would want to see. Obviously, we're going to see more regulations because government was one of the most attacked areas together with telecommunication.
Yeah.
So we're going to see government like tighten cybersecurity. I'm really interested to see if anyone will take up the challenge and create a cybersecurity startup or more cybersecurity startups that are African, that are dealing with all this surface area that is being created by the digital landscape growing. Yeah.
So with cybersecurity is a constantly evolving space, just like any other thing in the digital space. Is quite fast moving. And sometimes it's hard for things like regulation to catch up with that. And just like you said, this is an opportunity for startups in cybersecurity to fill this gap and work on solutions for these issues, these threats, these attacks. Well, I think something that also plays into the next story is cloud providers. So in Nigeria, the National Information Technology Development Agency, commonly called NITDA, has created a data classification framework that encourages cloud service providers to establish local operations in Nigeria. Part of the data that they are trying to keep within the country is finance, healthcare, and government sectors. These data should essentially stored within Nigeria, and then maybe other data can be stored outside. This is quite interesting because I worked at a health tech startup a couple of years ago, and that was one of the issues that they were trying to see how they could get around storing patient data. What happened was that they were exploring options like local cloud storage providers to store this sensitive data on, because they, according to the founder at the time, they couldn't store this information outside Nigeria. We never got to that stage because the startup didn't launch eventually. But now, where I see this news of this new framework, I feel that also plays a role. It reduces the exposure. If this data is within Nigeria, for example, then your protection for this data is also a bit easier. You can control a bit more about how that data is used as well. That's also another thing. What do you think about this? Is this now a trend, or is this something that you're seeing in Kenya as well?
First of all, for me, I'm really excited by this, and I hope it becomes a trend. And I hope that Kenya follows that trend as well, where we see that regulation that requires you to store certain data. And I hope eventually all data will be able to be stored within Africa, because I think this plays into Africa's sovereignty, which is something that I am very passionate about. Africa being able to sustain itself without relying on external infrastructure, right? And I think that pushes us towards that. Now, obviously, there will be some friction at the beginning because local data centers may be more expensive than the global cloud giants because they already have huge infrastructure with them. So we may see startups struggle a little. It's possible. I don't know yet. We'll have to see whether they will struggle with affording the local data centers, or will the pricing become more competitive because demand is coming in, and maybe supply will increase because we'll see more and more people get into that space and provide those local data centers. But I'm really excited about that. And I'm very hopeful that other countries will follow suit, and we'll see more cloud investments coming into Africa, and us having lots of sovereignty of controlling our own data, controlling how it is protected, controlling where it is kept. So that really excites me quite a bit, to be honest with you. Because now will local giants like AWS have to partner with local data centers? That's something I'm interested to see if that is something that will happen, where they will partner so that if we are servicing, let's say, a bank, we partner with local data centers that will put in all the sensitive data that needs to be local, and then the rest can be on our other data centers. So I don't know how that will happen, but definitely something I'm looking forward to seeing.
Or we would see something like acquisitions by these global giants like Amazon. They will start to see them acquiring local startups, or at least trying to acquire local startups. And then this brings in investments from these global giants as well, because I think one of the issues that we may have with local providers is scaling. The moment you start to scale, how will these local providers fare? That remains to be seen.
Yeah. I also want to see how that affects energy production in Africa, because I think data centers consume a lot of energy, if I'm not wrong. I'd like to see how that possibly motivates and grows green energy, maybe solar energy in Africa. So that's also something that might be tied into that. So I think there are a lot of industries that might be boosted by that one single move.
Yeah. And like you said, it definitely leads to a lot more energy consumption. And for a country like Nigeria, where we don't have steady power supply, depending on the area you are in, sometimes you don't have lights for a couple of weeks even. How do you?
What?
Yes, yes. It depends on the area you are in. Some areas, okay, you would see lights for a couple of hours in a day, and there are some areas you don't see light for weeks. For example, I was talking about my mom's place. They haven't had lights for like a month now. So you have to run alternate power solutions like generators or solar and things like that. So how do you now power these data centers? So again, it's for me, it's like yes, it's a good thing in one sense, but on the other hand, there are certain issues that needs to be addressed. Whether that is will be addressed with more investment into power, because the data center has to be on. It can't go off at any point. It just has to be on. So there's definitely going to be more investment in operational costs and things like that. There are challenges, but the main thing is that this is a positive move. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Tech Tides Africa podcast. Remember, leave a comment or share with your friends. We'll see you next Thursday at the same time and place you get your podcast. Until then, stay well.